There's something canonically wrong about this particular image here. Now, Nino shouldn't be carrying a book because she can't read. However, I know the lore behind this. I know she just improvises, but I'm sure I, as a teacher, could help her get some reading done. And then could you imagine how powerful she truly would be? All right, enjoy the video.
Let the lesson begin.
Hey guys, Akariss here, bringing you another Fire Emblem Heroes video. Today's video is going to cover Resplendent Nino, who is our next upcoming Resplendent. Now, she is definitely one of the more fan favorites of Heroes, I would say, and I'm probably one of the few who probably don't have her built or invested in any way. So this obviously doesn't apply to me, but I'm sure many are happy with that particular Resplendent. I think she's actually pretty solid once we get into exactly why her Resplendent makes her better. However, consider this a Nino analysis video, so you don't necessarily need the Resplendent for any of this. Just consider it like a 2 to all stats, which is essentially a couple 5 merges, 4 to 5 merges or so, which, you know, it makes a difference, but you can still use Nino effectively even with what I'm about to show you. So first we'll actually cover her art. I actually really like this design. It does remind me of Lou quite a bit, especially this particular variation, but I really like it. I think it fits her perfectly, considering there is some consistency between Black Fang and Embla, you know, Veronica and Asker and such don't always have to be all big and bad together. But the art is really well done. I think this is one of the better ones for sure. My favorite still probably being Niles, but definitely looks pretty solid in my opinion. I'm not a great critic of art. I think it's all subjective. So if you like it, you like it. And I'm sure there's some of you who don't. But I like it. And I also liked Nino when I played FE7 many decades ago. Nonetheless, I think I was definitely using more of Pent or Urk back then, but Nino was a nice addition and had a good story arc from my memories of playing that. So first off, if you actually forgot what Nino's weapon does, I've decided to put it down below. It's essentially Blade Tome without the special acceleration disable or like special denial by making your special slower and whatnot. And her preference refine is even attack wave. Now, I'm going to probably say this, and many of you might disagree, but I don't feel like even attack wave is very consistent in probably any content except maybe PvE content. But even then, I might argue it's not, as we'll go in a moment here. So my opinion is go for a speed or attack refine instead, or possibly something else. Again, that's something I want to show you and for you to consider as to why Nino might actually be better than you think for more than just the big nuker role. Blade Tome is still extremely good, although it does suffer a little bit when you run into the distant defense 4 foes, lull foes, dull ranged, anything like that definitely makes her much weaker, but that doesn't mean that she's a low quality unit. In fact, looking at the Resplendent stats here with no IV, 35-38 is still very respectable stat spread post Resplendent, and of course she has access to 15 flowers, being a really old unit, so that is pretty solid even in today's game. And even if you didn't have Resplendent, it's still very good. So first up, if you want to see how it looked at max investment or refine, just the weapon and such, no IVs, it still ends up being pretty solid. 57 attack and 46 speed is no slouch. In today's game, that's still really good even among green mage candidates, and this mostly comes from the fact that she has access to 15 flowers and that she does focus quite a bit of her stats into attack and speed compared to other first gen units. I mean, if you look at literally Bowie and Merrick, for example, you'll see that Nino does come out way ahead. Even Soren, who is a little bit closer, comes out way ahead. So this is probably your cookie cutter, most common Nino build ever. There's probably nothing more, but we've decided to upgrade with Fury 4. Obviously, if you don't have Fury 4, run Fury 3. This is essentially your go-to PvE build. So you go and bring 3 dancers in Nino and start killing everything because your attack stat is going to be sky high. You could use something like a Rouse in the sea, by the way, to get yourself self-buff. I've covered Rouses in a previous video. Again, Nino is a good candidate for that, but I'm not going to use Rouse in this video in particular. Fury, Brazen, Desperation all has good synergy and leads to you basically nuking everything in Abyssal or PvE content. If you choose to actually use her in AR, I feel she has fallen off a little bit, but that's because the best strategy for this was Vantage. And right now, Vantage isn't really in a great place. Despite that, I think I had a replay in the previous week's replay season where I did get aced by a Nino, so it's not always the case. And Nino, I think, could use something like this to great effect. Most of her power comes through her weapon because it's a blade tome, so as long as you're not running into DD4 units or low units or something like that, this will work out pretty well. I think she still, like Vantage units in general, struggle against damage reduction units, which are still more and more common, and you can't really push through that. But if you're running Miracle and something like Flashing Blade, you can get your Miracle up basically off of 1 or 2 snipes if you can set that up. So depending on the team you run into, this can be really solid. On top of that, since Nino has a monstrous attack stat, she likely could punch through the bulkiest of units, because effectively through Blade Tome you could go all the way up to about 100 attack, which is, again, pretty good. So if you use her as a carry, this could work, but it is very specific on the teams you run into. It's not always going to work, but it definitely can in some scenarios. Now, what I feel is a far better scenario is something like an AoE special Nino cleanup kind of scenario. And again, use what you have, folks. Don't take the builds you see here at face value. Use the fodder you have and try to mix and match. Some stats lost here or some variations still do really well. For example, Windsweep in B is probably an okay alternative. Maybe you run Desperation, maybe you run Ardent Sacrifice and use like Duma, upheaval damage to get yourself into desperation range. There's all a bunch of creativity you can do here to make it more consistent. But if you have maybe someone like Raphael with Infantry Pulse, you could do something like this and have a Blazing Wind ready to go and smash all those far save armors who give you a really hard time and break through it, because you just have so much effective attack through Iris Tome, through the comparison of attack versus res, or attack stat is really high when invested this heavily. Next up is a more unique take on Nino. Thanks to Resplendent giving you 2 to all stats and access to 15 flowers, and her fairly even bulk, I actually believe that something like this could work really well. Again, most of your offensive throughput comes from the weapon, and she already has a good speed stat. So what you could do with Resplendent is focus on the bulk, which comes through defense and res. Now, foddering Mila is a big oof here for Bracing Stance 3, but you could maybe use defense res solo for, or something else that gives you extremely good bulk in A slot. What you could effectively do with this is actually reach somewhere in the 50s in defensive and res bulk, use null follow-up to deny doubles from stuff like Duma and Cyros, and just get, again, all your damage through Iris Tome, and I think that's really effective. Something like this supported with like a male Corrin behind it is gonna be really tanky, which out of a mage seems really whack, but it is what it is. And she fits pretty nicely into Astra Season, has fairly good matchups against everything in Astra Season. There's not, except Lif, I guess. Lif would maybe pose somewhat of a problem, but it's Lif, you don't see him that often, so I don't know, I don't think so. Of course, more threatening units like Sigurd, Elwood, Legendary Sigurd, and such, you might see them, and they definitely could give you a problem. In fact, Lysithia, if you see those definitely are not the greatest of matchups for Nino, but Nino herself with bulk should be a strong consideration. Now, additionally, you could even opt for a null C variant rather than a null follow-up variant and use her somewhat as a more specific counter to the teams you run into. I actually believe if you give her this much bulk, she could probably take the auto doubles from both Zeros because of color advantage, and Duma, who otherwise doesn't really, he's not really that strong anymore. So something like this could work really well. The reason you would even offer Miracle is because she doesn't really need any of the specials for damage. Honestly, maybe even an AoE special would be fine as to be used here. But yeah, with Mystic Boost, Miracle, and honestly just the amount of bulk she's getting here, she'll fit pretty nicely. As you'll notice, we actually put Attack Res Menace in the C, and I feel that's actually a really solid synergy with this type of build because it gives you bulk, it gives you power, synergizes with Iris Tome as well, self-sufficient buffing, and she's a frontliner. So apparently Menace might have been made for Nino, who knows. Either way, I like it a lot. Now on defense, I feel it's a bit more questionable, and that's because you will run into units who use Distant Defense 4, you're gonna run into lull skills, you're gonna run into like pulse ties or pulse smokes, so it's much more difficult to use Nino, if you ask me, on defense, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. But if you feel like there's a place where she can't be affected by any of this, or you have good coverage of other more problem units, then Nino would be pretty solid. Keep in mind that one of her biggest counters is a Distant Defense 4 Henriette, which is actually pretty much base kit. This build here with 30 impact should survive that, but you're not really going to be doing much damage other than the AoE. The AoE should actually hit her fairly well, about 20 to 30 damage because of her sky-high attack, depending on buffs and debuffs, and if you can set that up. But Wind Sweep and 30 impact combined here, impact against those mages, like Henriette, and Wind Sweep against the more problem common tanks you might see now, like Vector and Fallen Edelgard maybe, or Brave Edelgard and such. So this would do really well against those ones, and shouldn't do well against Henriette or Winteraltina, but still a very powerful threat to respect. Finally, for you Nino fans in Arena, we have a GDuel Infantry 4 variant here. This is essentially the type of Nino you would most likely want to use in Water Season, and should do okay against Chrom and Dimitri. You could still opt for a speed IV or a defense IV to make things a bit more comfortable, and even attack defense form as a seal could definitely be an option. So not much more to it, but yeah, Nino is okay in Water Season. Her bulk not being as high is a little bit of a problem, but she should match up fairly well against everything. Maybe falters to something like Leaf. Yeah. All right, and for you Wave fans, if you're a big Wave fan and you like the Nino dance, then I suggest a build like this for you. Don't forget that the Wave is essentially some sort of dance, so you like your buffs, you like your Iris Tome synergy, there's your Wave build. Go ahead and make it happen. Yep. Alright folks, that basically covers my full Nino analysis. Again, if you don't have the Resplendent, that's fine. She's still super solid. Maybe the one thing I wouldn't recommend is maybe a tank build if you don't have the Resplendent, but I think the tank build does become more prominent or more viable because of Resplendent, and all the other variants with nuking or PvE, definitely, it doesn't matter. I just think the art is pretty solid. She's cute. It's good. Nino fans, hope you're happy. Let me know what you think of Nino in the comments below. What Resplendent are you still looking forward to? I'd like you to turn that thumbs up and on, and sub if you haven't already. I know some of you still aren't. Finally, if you enjoy the content, you want to see it happening, please consider joining the membership channel, maybe the Patreon in the description below. You guys make this happen, and it keeps coming because of you. I'll see you in the next one. Much love.
It's over.